That's just your interpretation. I can't tell you the number of times I've heard that exact line when talking with Latter-day Saints about critical verses in the Bible. I'll bring up a verse and say, this is what the Bible clearly says, and someone will respond with, that's just your interpretation, and we're left at somewhat of an impasse. And I'm left wondering, how can we know what interpretation is correct? How can we know if the way we're understanding the text of the Bible is the way it's meant to be understood? So we thought it would be a really helpful practice to actually show how we interpret the Bible. Just walk through selected sections verse by verse in order to really understand what it is that the text of the Bible is saying. And so today I thought it would be good if we started with a verse that lots of Christians use in dialogue with Latter-day Saints, and that is Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9. I'm going to actually start back in verse 1 and just give some context to the passage we're going to be going through. So let's get started. Paul starts here, and he says, you, speaking to the ones reading this letter, you were dead in the trespasses and sins in which you once walked. Okay, so first notice this word here, were, is not present tense. This is a past tense verb here. And so Paul is saying something that was previously true about this you group, the readers of the book of Ephesians. You were dead previously. In the past, you were dead. And then he goes on to give a prepositional phrase starting with this word in. It says, you were dead in the trespasses and sins in which you once walked. So two things kind of mark this deadness: trespasses and sins. Trespasses and sins. So these are just wrongdoing. This is wrongdoing. These are things that break God's law. That's how Paul is identifying the deadness that we were in. It's not that we were physically dead. We were dead spiritually. We were dead in our iniquities. And notice once again, he says, in which you once walked. Once walked. That is definitely tied to the past tense nature of that verb were earlier on in verse 1. We see that he's talking about something that was previously true. You walked, you lived consistently in this state of deadness, in these iniquities, these trespasses and sins. Paul then continues on further explaining the nature of this deadness, of these trespasses and sins. You are following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, and then further explaining the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience. And we'll pause there real quick. So, we were dead, and this deadness resulted in following the course of this world. Now, when we see this world in the Bible, a lot of times, especially in Pauline usage, this is not a good thing. This world is sinful and wicked and broken. The course of this world is a course destined for destruction. It's a course that leads straight to the condemnation and judgment of God. We're following in the patterns, the course, the practices of this world. That really fits well with this idea of trespasses and sins. He then further clarifies following, same word, following here, following there, following the prince of the power of the air. So first we have this, the prince. And then he is further clarifying who this prince is. He's the prince of the power of the air. The air is kind of modifying that power, and this whole phrase is modifying who this prince is. A prince is a ruler of sorts, right? So there's a ruler of the power of the air. And he further clarifies that in this next little bit. The spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience. It's really worth noting here that we see this word now contrasted with this idea of having once walked and previously being dead. So while Paul is talking to the readers of Ephesians, there is this prince of the power of the air that is currently now at work in the sons of disobedience. This is really critical to understand. There are two groups of people Paul is kind of talking about. Those who once followed this prince and those who now are being affected by this spirit, the prince of the power of the air. And these people are called the sons of disobedience, the sons of disobedience. That's kind of strong language, sons of disobedience. Now, we notice disobedience here really ties to the idea of trespasses and sins in which you once walked. So we have this picture, two groups, Both of them at one point were following the prince of the power of the air. They were following the course of this world. But now you, Ephesians, you're not like that anymore. But he continues on in verse 3. Among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh. Okay, among whom. So whom, this is referring to a group of people. Who's he talking about? Well, this is referring back to the sons of disobedience. So among these sons of disobedience who are being affected by the spirit that is now at work, we all of us, once lived. So we have that language of once lived tied to this earlier. This is lots of lines here. This is why everyone says they can't read my Bible, because my Bible ends up looking like this, and it's hard to actually see what's going on. But in any case, it's helpful to see he's using the same language. Among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh. Paul uses the word flesh here. I'm going to highlight that red. That's not good. Flesh, we have disobedience, we have trespasses, we have sins, we have the course of this world, right? When he talks about flesh, that's our inner self that wars against us. That's disobedient to God. So we once lived in accordance with the passions, the desires of our flesh. And then he further clarifies here with a participle, carrying out the desires of the body and the mind, and were by nature, notice once again, were is past tense, were by nature children of wrath. So we have this idea of the sons of disobedience. Now we have the children of wrath. And then it says, like the rest of mankind. So all mankind, the rest of mankind, are all children of wrath. What does it mean to be a child of wrath? It means that we will inherit wrath. All of us, all mankind is going to inherit wrath. Why? Because we carried out the desires of the body. We lived in the passions of our flesh. So this is the state of all mankind, this state of wrath, this state of coming judgment. We were wicked, we were dead, we were unable to be alive in our trespasses and sins. But these are only the first 3 verses, so let's continue on to verse 4. But God. Okay, this word but here is really great. It indicates a contrast. So there's something different going on in verse 6 and onward than what was going on here in verses 1 through 3. You know, this says verse 6, 5, and 6. That is not correct. This is verse 4. That's my fault. Sorry about that. So, but God, being rich in mercy. Now, being rich in mercy is actually modifying here who God is. God is a God who is rich in mercy. To be rich is have an excess of mercy. What is mercy? Well, biblically, we see it as not giving people what they deserve. So God, being rich in mercy, he doesn't give people what they deserve. And then he even further clarifies, because of the great love with which he loved us. So here he is fronting this because clause. In other words, he's starting with this, the reason why something is going to be the case, but he has not yet introduced what he's chiefly talking about. He's giving the rationale before introducing it as a kind of a way of building anticipation for what he's going to say. So God, we see here, he's rich in mercy. He has great love. And this love is not just static. He has loved us with it. He has given us this love, this mercy. And then Paul continues to even further clarify here, even when we were dead in our trespasses. Well, what does that sound like? Notably, that is just like, right here, dead in our trespasses, just like our bit in verse 1, dead in the trespasses and sins. And here we see, even when we were dead in our trespasses, he made us alive together with Christ. Okay? So this is what God has done. God was rich in his mercy. We'll highlight orange. Rich in his mercy. He has great love. And even when we were dead in our trespasses, this is the critical point. He made us alive together with Christ. We have been made alive together with Christ. And then we have this kind of subnote. By grace, you have been saved. By grace, you have been saved. Notice, he's switching his pronouns a little bit here. So we have this idea that God loved us. We have this, even when we were dead in our trespasses, he made us alive together. In the previous verse, he started off with a you. And then he said, you walked like this. among whom, verse 3 says, among whom we all lived, and so on. So he's switching back between this you and this we, this you and this we. And here he says, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made alive together with Christ, by grace you have been saved. Why would he switch to you? I think not because he's trying to not include himself, but because he's emphasizing something true about the Ephesians. They have been saved by grace, have been. What tense is have been saved? It's not future. It's not, in this case, he's not saying we will be saved, though he does say that elsewhere. He's saying, by grace you have been saved. You were saved in the past, you're saved now, you'll be saved into the future. And all this ultimately is because we've been made, because we've been made alive together with Christ. But he's not done. He's made us alive together with Christ, and what else has he done? He's raised us up with him and seated us with him in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus. So God has raised us up. He has seated us in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus. Now this is interesting because are you living in the heavenly places right now? Probably not. What Paul is doing here is he is talking about a spiritual reality pointing towards a certain and secure future. So we are in part now seated with him in the heavenly places. We have been raised up spiritually, but we will in the future experience the fullest extent of this. We will be physically raised from the dead, and we will actually be seated with him in the heavenly places. We will rule over all of heaven and earth. And so this is just listing the things that God has done. He's made us alive together with Christ. He's raised us up. He's seated us in Christ Jesus. Notice for Paul, this in Christ Jesus is really critical with Christ. If you go study Ephesians chapter 1, we see the same theme everywhere. And then we have this here, so that in the coming ages. So that is a clause that indicates purpose or result. So why did God do all this? Well, the reason is that so that in the coming ages, that's a time, it's when, time, that's not now, it's coming in the future, he might show the immeasurable riches of his grace and kindness towards us in Christ Jesus. So why did God make us alive together with Christ? Why has he raised us up? Why has he seated us? So that he could show his grace in kindness all in Christ Jesus. The point is to exemplify his own attributes. That's why God has done that. And then we go to the verses in question here. For is a really helpful word. Just kind of indicates that this verse is actually strengthening an idea that came before. So we see why God did all this. And here Paul is further explaining what it is exactly that God did. He introduces that by for. He's going back and kind of summarizing all of these truths that he said here in verse 8. For by grace, by grace. This is talking about means. If you say, I don't know, you use the word by, you're kind of talking about the way in which you did something. So Paul is explaining that the means by which all this has come to pass is because of grace, because of the grace of God. Grace is similar to mercy, but not exactly the same. It says in the Bible, it's often used of us getting things we don't deserve. So for by grace, you, again we have that, he's talking to the Ephesians here, you have been saved. And then he gives a secondary means here, through faith. So grace is kind of extending out through all of this. Grace is the overarching means. But the immediate means, you have been saved, is here seen through faith. How is it that man can be saved? Well, man is saved through faith. This is very important. If you don't have faith, according to this, you will not be saved. You will not be saved if you don't have faith. And then he further clarifies, and this, now the this, if you study this out, is actually referring back to the faith, to salvation, and also to grace. All three of those things. And these things, this is not your own doing. It's not because of what you have done. It is the gift of God. This salvation, this thing that God has done graciously is not because of your own doing. Doing could be like working or actions or because of you. It has nothing to do with you. It is the gift of God A gift is something received, not something worked for. If you work for it, according to Romans 4:4, it's not a gift, it's what you've earned. It's the gift of God. That means that it has to be by grace. It's not by grace if you work for it and get it. It's by grace if you don't work for it and get it. And that's what Paul is saying. And he even clarifies that then in verse 9. Not a result or an outcome of works. This is not because of something you've done. And then we have another so that, indicating purpose. So that no one may boast. So that no one can boast or have any grounds for boasting before God. Paul says, specifically, the way you're saved is by faith, so that no one can say before God, I have anything to boast of. I have any good works or good deeds that give me any kind of status or platform before God or before anyone else. I have done nothing to earn this. It is a gift. It is by God's grace, and it is received through faith. Paul overemphasizes this point again and again and again throughout his writings in the New Testament. He's very clear here. So that indicates purpose. The reason it's not by works is so that no one may boast, which means if there was a system of salvation that said we must do any kind of works, whether that be endowment ceremonies or baptisms or anything like that, if there were works or sacraments or whatever that we needed to do, we would have grounds to boast. It is not received through works. It is received through faith, and that is a gift of God. But Paul doesn't end there. He clarifies then further in verse 10. It's not a result of works, so that no one may boast, for we are his workmanship. In other words, we are God's work. We are the work of God. He does the work in us. We were created in Christ Jesus. We were made in Christ Jesus for the purpose of good works, which these good works God prepared beforehand so that we should walk in them. Okay, so Paul is making it really clear. Works are not what earn us the status of salvation. Our good works are what God has done in us. We were created in Christ for good works because God prepared these good works beforehand that we should walk in them. Now, why is that the case? What's going on? Well, Paul will go on in Ephesians to talk more about that. But the point here is Paul includes the reason why Christians don't just shrug at doing works. A lot of people say, well, if you're saved by faith, you can go do whatever you want. You can live however you want, and it doesn't matter because you're already saved. What Paul is saying here is that our salvation necessarily results in good works, but they are not the thing that saves us. They are not the thing that makes us right with God. They're not the thing that gives us peace with God. We will enter God's kingdom purely because of his grace, because of his gifts. Yet those gifts result in us working out these works that God prepared beforehand. So, this is just a quick little overview of how I think through the text of Ephesians 2, 1 through 10. Hopefully that's really helpful for you just to see how someone kind of parses out those words. There's lots in this that I could have spent more time on, but for the sake of not boring everyone who's watching, I kind of glazed over it a little bit. But if you have particular questions, feel free to leave them below in the comments. If you'd like me to tackle another verse at some point, kind of walk through that, I'd love to do that. Just leave what verse you'd like me to do below in the comments as well. As always, thanks for watching, and have a blessed day.